Hello everyone, and this is BioPhoenix here. So today, we're going to be continuing talking about a series that I've already did a review on before, since this is part 2, and that happens to be the Valis series. So I did part 1 at episode 77, and today we are at episode 133. Now one thing I have to explain here before we begin is that since this is part 2, and in case you haven't seen part 1, I'm going to do a little bit of a recap of the general thoughts of what I said about the games I mentioned within part 1. Also, I'm not going to get too much within the story within this one, mainly because I've also explained that in part 1. In fact, all the games that are in this part that I'm going to be talking about are pretty much the same games that I mentioned within part 1, but only that this one are all going to be on the PC Engine CD. So in case you have not seen my review on Valis games part 1, then here's a little bit of a recap that I can give. So the first game that I looked at was Valis the Phantasm Soldier on the Sega Genesis. And I thought this one was pretty decent fun, but of course it does have its issues, like for an example, the hit detection took a lot of time to get used to, and the jumping was a little bit stiff, but otherwise I did kind of enjoy this one. But I'd say that the music though was easily the best part. I mean, like they did a really good job implementing it on the Sega Genesis. And then the second one I did was Sid of Valis, which is basically like a spin-offs kinda sorta thing related to Valis II. But just this one had a chibi style to it. And this one just really fucking sucked. Mostly because the controls in the game were just really bad. Also, the music in the game was also a huge letdown as well. And it kinda is unfortunate that this one had to fucking suck, because this one actually did have some pretty interesting ideas that none of the other games had. Like for an example, like whenever you pause the menu, you can actually select like a different outfit you want, and it would actually give you different stats. So it made it kinda like an RPG, if that's the closest thing you can make it up to. Also, you can actually shoot straight up, which as far as I know, it's the only game in the series where you can do that. So yeah, bad controls really ruined this game, and that's why I think it really sucks to shitter. And finally, the last one that I taken a look at was the Genesis version of Valis III. And out of the three, this one was easily the best one, for not only did it have a lot better controls, better graphics, a really good OST, and it actually had more characters to play as, although of course you can only use them on certain parts, but still, it had a lot more variety to go on. So that's the one that I'd recommend playing the most out of the Genesis/Mega Drive ones. So that sums up what I talked about in part 1, and now we're going to be talking about part 2, where I'll be taking a look at the PC Engine CD versions of these games. So the first one we're going to be taking a look at here is Mugen Senshi Valis, also known as The Legend of a Phantasm Soldier. So this one was developed by Riot and published by Talent, and it was only released in Japan in the year 1992. So because this game is exactly like the first game on the Genesis, where it tells the same story, the same general levels, where this time the cutscenes have a little bit more animation going on, and it has full voice acting. So while this game still has the same setting as the Genesis version, the one big difference is that the level layout is actually a lot different. You probably won't notice a huge difference with the first level, but as you get farther through the game, there is more platforming that needs to be done. And there was a couple of power-ups that are in this one that were not in the other version. But one big difference is that in this game, the dash attack that you can do actually does damage to the enemies, where if you try doing that in the Genesis version, you'll only end up damaging yourself. So yeah, you do get a lot of the same enemies and like the same bosses, and there are more cutscenes between each level. But otherwise, everything else is pretty self-explanatory, and of course I've already explained it within part 1. So now let's go on to the other things, like the controls. So the controls this time around are definitely a much bigger improvement. So like I said in the Genesis version, that the hit detection was very hit and miss, and also the jumping in that game felt pretty stiff. And this game fixes all those issues, so yes, the hit detection in this game is a hell of a lot better. And the jumping also feels a lot better too. In fact, you actually don't need to hold up and then press jump to do a higher jump. Instead, you just simply jump. Easy as that. Also, the control layout for this game is very easy to understand, so really the only thing you really need to know is that if you hold up and then press the attack button, then you get to use a magic spell. And then ducking while jumping allows you to do the dash attack where, you know, it actually attacks enemies. So overall, I gotta say that the controls in this one are not only a really good improvement, but they also do feel really good in general. So now, as for the game's graphics, this is a really awesome looking game. Now I will say, the Genesis version of this game still looks pretty good. Now there are some parts that do lack a little bit of detail, but for the most part though, I thought it did look pretty good for Genesis standards. But this version just looks way better, but I guess that's to be expected. So there's a lot of nice and bright colors, there's also a lot of really good details when it comes to the backgrounds, the character sprites. In fact, the animation on the character sprites are really awesome looking. And the cutscenes do look really good for what they are, as again, they are also very bright and colorful. And while some might say that the animation is a little bit choppy for the fact that it has like little segments where it animates pretty well and then it like stops for a sec. But one thing to keep in mind is that when this game first came out, this was a very new thing at the time, so imagine seeing this like back when it first came out, it would have blown my mind. But it still does look really good. Also, I do like the general art style for the game, where I do like all like the different character designs for like the villains and even like the main character Yuko. So for the graphics overall, for a game that came out all the way back in 1992 on the PC Engine CD, this is great looking shit. So now, as for the game's music, the music in this one is just absolutely fucking amazing. So as I already said, the Genesis version soundtrack is definitely no slouch. I do think that one is still really good and holds up really well. But the one thing that I really love about this version's soundtrack is that it has a lot of rock and trance fused together. Now I know some of you might find this to be a really weird comparison, but I have to say, it kinda reminds me of something from the band Rush, and you know what? That's pretty fucking awesome. So with that said, I really don't have any complaints with the OST at all. I mean, there's no tracks in the game that I thought were like sounding really horrible or anything like that. I think all of them sound really good, suit the themes of the levels and all that kind of stuff. And of course, a lot of the songs are also very catchy, so the music is just all around fucking amazing. So now, if you want to go out and buy this game, well of course, this game is only in Japan, so you're more than likely going to have to import it, and I can't remember exactly, but I think the PC Engine CD is region free. I'm pretty sure it is, because I do know for a fact that the Hue cards are region locked, which is kind of an asshole, but thankfully I think this one you can actually play on a North American TurboGrafx CD. And the prices on this one are actually not as bad as I thought it was going to be. So the lowest that I've seen it for was $34.99, which, like I said, that's actually not as bad as I was thinking it was going to be. And then there's some going for $35.99, and then there's one going for about $50, and then there's another one going for about $80. So considering the system that it's on, this one is actually not as much as I thought it was going to be. I was expecting this one to be like well over about in like the $80 to $100 range, but no, there's a couple of cheaper ones out there. Of course, that's just if you think $35 is a good enough price. But of course, if you do want to emulate the game, the best way that I've played this one was actually playing it through the emulator called Turbo Engine, which does work really, really well. Since with that emulator, you don't have to bother with using something like daemon tools to mount your shit. So overall, when it comes to the very first Valis game on the PC Engine CD, this is not only a great improvement over the first version that I've taken a look at, but it's an overall a really good and really fun action platformer. So one thing I have to mention is that this game can be pretty challenging, but it's definitely not impossible. In fact, I'd actually say that it's easier than the Genesis version. Also, I do like the game's level design since a lot of them are pretty short, but there is no checkpoints. So let's just say for an example, if you get to the boss in one area and you die, and you gotta do the level all over again, it doesn't feel like it takes too much time to get back to where you were, so it doesn't feel too fatiguing. And you do get unlimited continues, which is always awesome. Because there is a few parts within this game that were pretty frustrating, but once I was able to beat them, it felt really satisfying. So yeah, this version of the game is definitely highly recommended. So now let's get a move on to the next game in the series, and that happens to be Valis II. And shockingly enough, this game came out in North America. So this one was developed by Lasersoft and it was published by NEC in North America, but in Japan it was published by Talent, and it came out in the year 1990. Now you're probably thinking, wait, how the fuck did this one come out before the first one? Well, one thing you gotta remember is that the original first game came out all the way back in 1986, and that first game that I just talked about is a remake. where this game is the official sequel, which originally came out in 1989 in Japan. So that explains why the release dates may seem a little weird. So this game is the original version of Valis Valis, which I've taken a look at in the last episode, and which I did say fucking sucked. So very similar to the first game, you go from point A to point B, and then at the end you gotta fight a boss, and of course between the stages you get the cutscenes which progresses through the story, and you do get a little bit more magic spells and different types of shots that you can pick up for upgrades. And one thing that I do like that they did added is that you can actually see the boss's health bar now. But other than that, it's pretty much the same basic stuff. But one thing that really is unfortunate is the game's level design. Now sure, there is a little bit of platforming going on, but not nearly as much. I mean, most of the game usually takes place within like a giant hallway where a bunch of enemies just start running at you. But sometimes at the end of these hallways you gotta fight some mini-bosses which are unavoidable. But thankfully there are checkpoints within the game since the levels this time are much longer, but unfortunately, like I already said, the level design is pretty dull. So there's really not much I can add here when it comes to gameplay wise. It's more or less some of the same stuff like I said before, but only that it just feels a lot more tedious. So now let's get moving on to the game's controls. And the controls in this one are not nearly as good. But one positive thing I will say is that it's at least better than Valis. So I find that the game's controls don't feel as fluent as the other game, also you can't do a dash move anymore. Using magic is still done the same way, and it is responsive. But the one problem with this game that is also shared from Valis is that you actually run too close to the screen, and therefore your reaction time to enemies that will appear right in front of you, you gotta be like super fast about it. And it took me a lot of time to get used to that, but man, this game is just really fucking tough, but not for like the same reason why the first game was tough, because it was actually like a good challenge. This one feels hard because the controls in it are just not nearly as good. Now you're probably thinking that I think that the controls in this game are like complete utter shit. No, I don't think they are like that bad. Like I said, they are at least a lot better than Valis's controls, since that one felt like a floating dog turd. But this one just feels a little bit stiff, and of course the fact that you're so close to one end of the screen is just really freaking annoying. So overall, the controls are definitely not good, and they are kinda bad, but they're not the worst that I've ever seen. So now, as for the game's graphics, okay, so as this game comparison to the first game, it looks like crap. But as its own, it does look okay, but there's still one thing that is kinda weird, is that this is supposed to be a TurboGrafx CD game. And it really looks like a game that would just be on the regular PC engine. So knowing this, the only thing that really takes advantage of the power of the CD unit is really the cutscenes, and even then, the cutscenes are not as good. So the way that the animation flow is still the same thing like I said about the first game, but sadly the cutscenes just don't look as good. Also the resolution of it looks a lot smaller, and you get stuck with this green border around it, and I know you're probably thinking, oh that's probably an emulation error. No, that's actually how the game is supposed to be. Now some might say I am being a little bit too harsh on this game, but yeah, you're probably right. This game doesn't look terrible. Like I said, as its own, it does look fine. Even the cutscenes actually do look okay for what they are. But I will say that the in-game graphics does look a little bit better, although one issue I still have with them is that the animation of your sprite just looks really choppy. In fact, I've seen way better animation being done on the NES. But at least it still has some good color, and all the enemy designs still look pretty good for what they are, so yeah, I don't know, the graphics in this one are kinda mixed for me, where there's a couple of things about it that do look alright, and then there's some things that just could have been a little bit better. But given the fact that this is supposed to be a TurboGrafx CD game, I do suspect that it is going to look a lot better than, let's say, like a regular TurboGrafx game. But either way, it's definitely not the worst looking TurboGrafx game that I've ever seen ever. So now, as for the game's music, thankfully I will say that the music in this one is still really great. It still has some of the same feels of the music from the first game, but unfortunately there's not as much tracks that I like on this one compared to the first game's OST, but there are still some good noteworthy ones. But there is a few good atmospheric tracks, so at least there is that they do fit with the levels. So that's all I have to say about the music, and yeah, it's probably the best part about this entire game. So now, if you want to go out and buy this game, so this one did actually come out in English, so let's take a look at that one. So I saw one copy going for about $65, and then there's another one going for $94.99, and then there is a sealed one going for $230, yippee. But as for the Japanese version, I can safely say that this one is much cheaper. So I've seen quite a few of them going for about $30, $35, but I have seen two that were going for $20 and $22.99. So I do think that is definitely much better than paying some of these ridiculous prices on the English version of it. And like I said, I do believe that it is region free, so there is that. Oh, and speaking of English, I gotta talk about the voice acting in this one. And yeah, the voice acting in this is pretty bad, but it's pretty fucking funny. So here are some good examples of some Academy Awards.
I am the Red Salamander Zaruga, one of Roglus's 12 generals. Come, warrior Vari, let's engage in combat!
Why have you come to the world of reality?
I must have your sword. Welcome to the place of Scarlet Fire Toe.
I shall destroy all those who protect Magus.
Even though you have succeeded in breaking the Emperor's power, you have not been able to stop the war.
The exercise of power alone cannot bring peace.
You just gotta love that shit. So now, as for my overall thoughts on this game, is that Valis II is, oh man. This game just really isn't that great. I mean, it's not, like, uber terrible, but it's not really, like, good. I don't even know if I'd really consider it to be mediocre either. I was just not having a great time with this game, where not only were the controls were just not very good, but also the levels were just not really good either. So maybe that's a big reason why the game like Cid of Valis really fucking sucked hard, was because it based it after one of like the worst games in the mainline series. But yeah, I'd rather play this game than Cid of Valis any day of the week. But that really ain't saying much, but either way, this one is just kind of a stinker. So now, moving on to the last game that I'm going to be talking about within Valis Games Part 2, and that happens to be Valis III on the PC Engine CD. So this one has the same developer and publisher as number 2, and this version also did come outside of Japan, so it seems like that we got 2 and 3, but not 1. Weird. But before I talk about Valis III, one thing that I want to talk about that I haven't even mentioned yet in this part is that the game's box art. So I know I mentioned in Valis Games Part 1 that there's actually a lot of Mega Drive covers that I really like that is a part of this series. Same thing goes for the PC Engine CD. But when it comes to this version's box art in North America, good god, what the fuck? I think they used too much of the uglifier effect on this one. And in some weird way, it kinda reminds me of another favorite game of mine being Kagero Deception 2, where that box art in English just looks like complete crap. So yeah, it's unfortunate that this is one of those games that people probably looked at and thought it looked ugly as shit just from the cover. Well anyways, I thought I'd get that out of the way. So anyways, as for the game itself, this game is a lot like the Genesis version. Like, the heads-up display looks exactly the same thing, the way that the levels are designed is also the same, although there are a few exceptions, and I'll get back to that in a moment. And you also get to be able to play as 3 different characters, which is also the same as the Genesis version, although in this one it's much easier to switch between different characters, although you can't switch between them during boss fights. And of course there's more cutscenes and much more dialogue within this one. And the voice acting is back too. So yeah, when it comes to the game's levels, there's actually a few new levels that are in this game that were not in the Genesis version. But the one thing that the Genesis does what Turbo don't, okay, that doesn't sound as good. But to be serious though, the one thing that the Genesis does have that the TurboGrafx version does not is one exclusive level. So it's quite the interesting trade-off. But yeah, everything else when it comes to the gameplay is exactly what you'd suspect if you've seen my review on the Genesis version. Where you got the sword meter that can extend longer and it has more like powerful attacks, the usual magic spells that you can acquire, and of course the 3 different characters all play a little bit differently. Where Yuko has the usual sword wave attack, and then Valna has the magic crystal balls attack, which is like a projectile, and Cham ever so happens to have a whip, yeah, much like in Castlevania. And speaking of Castlevania, this game really does remind me of the 3rd game on NES, where not only do you have different characters to play as, But of course you also get the whip, and even the way how you pick up items is by hitting those floating emblems. And lastly, whenever you get hit by an enemy in this game, you actually go flying back a bit, and of course if you do this over a ledge, then you die. And because of this, I do find that Valis III is probably the most challenging game in the series. Well, let me rephrase that. It's the most challenging game in the series that is reasonable, because personally, I found Valis II was even harder than this game, but like I already said, that game was just not as fun to play through. So yeah, not a whole lot that I can add here that I've already said within the first review, but anyways, so now let's get moving on to the controls. And this time around, they are actually really good. So not only is it responsive, but it also feels really good too. And as for the button layout, it is really good for the most part, like it is everything that you would suspect to be in a Valis game, except for one thing. And this one thing is just really fucked up. I don't know what the hell they were thinking, but you know how you do the dash attack? Well, in this game, you gotta do it by holding down in the start button, or in this case it would be the run button. Now that right there is some Batman Forever bullshit. Yeah, even the Genesis version didn't have that issue. So it's really unfortunate that that's like the one thing that they fucked up on with the controls, but other than that though, everything else is really easy to understand where, one button jumps, the other button attacks, and then of course being able to change characters is easy. You just press the start button as its own. Select pauses, holding up and then jumping makes you jump higher. Yeah, holding down and jumping does not do shit in this game. That's why I was so confused on why I couldn't do the dash move. But other than that one thing, everything else about it is really good and does feel really good. And now, as for the game's graphics, this is a really nice looking game, although I don't think it looks as good as the first remake on the PC Engine CD, but it is a huge improvement over Valis II. And the cutscenes actually do look a lot nicer looking. They are much more bright and colorful, and of course they do move a little bit better. Now in comparison to the Genesis version, believe it or not, I'm actually kind of mixed on which one I like better, because there's actually certain stages that I do think look better on the TurboGrafx CD, and then there are some of them that actually do look better on the Genesis. But all the character sprites and the enemy designs still look all great as they ever did. So I think it's more of a preference thing on which one you'd like better between Genesis and TurboGrafx CD. But for me, it's just really hard to pick because I think both of them look great for what they are on. Now one thing to mention here that I thought was kind of amusing is that in the TurboGrafx CD version, you actually see the NEC logo in the background, and then in the Genesis version, it changed to Ren, as in Renovations, which published those versions. And as you can see, they both have a really nice sort of detail and a lot of bright colors, so which one you like better, it doesn't really matter because they both look really great. Now, as for the game's music, now this one personally, I do find that the PC Engine one does have much better music. But the Genesis version still has a really good OST that does work really well with the hardware, but the Turbo CD one I just like a little bit better, mostly because of the same reason of what I said about the remake of the first game on PC Engine CD. And now, as for the game's voice acting, well, as again, you're just gonna have to listen to it for yourselves right here, right now.
Battle is a just cause. We are fighting to save our spirit world and preserve our race. In order to do so, we have to conquer the dream world and move everyone there. Are all of you willing to die for me?
He is the ruler of the spirit world. He intends to move all the people in the spirit world to Earth and the dream world.
Then, what will happen to all the people on Earth and the dream world?
He intends to kill them all. He is killing everyone in the dream world as we speak now.
Oh my god.
Oh my god!
Yep, this shit is gold. So now, if you want to go out and buy this game, believe it or not, the PC Engine CD version is actually very cheap. There's actually quite a few of them going for about like $20, $25, usually between there. Although I have seen one for $30 and another one for $60, but yeah, fuck the $60 one. Now, I've only seen one English version on the TurboGrafx CD, and that one is going for $140. Yeah, I'm honestly not too surprised about that. Thinking about it now though, when I went to go see my old place back in April, I went to the game store over there that I used to go to all the time, and I did see an English copy of the game there, and it was actually even more complete, and it just happened to be cheaper. It was actually selling for $90. I don't know if shit just changed over time or what, but either way, it's still kind of a lot. but at least the PC Engine CD version is a hell of a lot cheaper, and at least it does have a lot better of a cover art, good god. So now, as for my overall thoughts on this game, not only is this just a great version of the game, but it's just a great game in general. But as much as I like this version, the one thing that is kind of fucked up is that doing the dash move in this game, and that's actually the one thing I will say that the Genesis version is far superior, since the graphics on both versions still look really good, but obviously the Turbo CD version does have better cutscenes. But as I already said, it is more of a preference thing, just like the music, although with the music I do prefer the Turbo CD version, but the Genesis version is no slouch. So it's kind of hard to say which one I really like better between the two, but either way, no matter which version you're playing of the game, you're doing it right, because honestly, Valis III is just a kick-ass game. But another tough choice is that, do I think this one is the best game in the series? Well, clearly, it's way better than 2, and I really like what they did with the remake of the first game. Although this one does have a little bit more content going on, like the fact that you can switch between different characters. The story is also much better, but like I said, I talked a little bit more about the story within part 1. But I do really like the graphics and music within the first remake the best. But overall, when it came to the CD versions, 1 and 3 are easily the best games that are worth checking out. So that's all I gotta say for Valis Games Part 2. And believe it or not, there is actually enough versions that I can do for Part 3. So there's a Famicom version, then there's also some computer system versions, like MSX, PC9801, stuff like that. And then there is the one numbered entry that I haven't talked about yet, and that happens to be Valis IV. So whenever I get around to doing Valis Games Part 3, which probably won't happen for quite some time, but it is more than likely that I am going to be taking a look at both versions of Valis IV. And finally, if you can believe it, there is actually a game called Valis X, which is indeed a porn game. I don't know how the hell I'm gonna review something like that, but I don't know, maybe I might do something funny about it. But before I end it off here, I just want to say that I'm actually really glad that I was finally able to play the CD add-on versions. Because ever since I first played the Genesis versions, I always wanted to play them, but it took me such a long time to find an emulator that actually worked right with these games. So I'm just really glad that I was finally able to experience these ones. Yes, including number 2, even though that game sucks, I will at least say that I am glad that I was at least able to experience it. So that'll be all for Valis Games Part 2, and probably won't be for a very long time for Part 3, so in the meantime I'll be taking a look at other random ass shit. So with that being said, thanks for watching and commenting, and have yourselves a great day.